The ferry crossing took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of gray Pacific water, salt wind sharp enough to sting, and the kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise you've been carrying without noticing. I stood at the bow the entire time, watching the island materialize out of the low morning fog like a secret someone had decided to finally tell. San Juan Island, or more precisely, the private northern end of it. A peninsula that didn't appear on any civilian map, owned entirely by the Sterling Vane Family Trust since 1987. The compound sat at the edge of the bluff like a statement. Glass and raw concrete and brushed steel. 3 stories of deliberate, architectural coldness overlooking the Strait of Georgia. Not a house, not even a home. A fortress that had been taught to pretend. I had studied the schematics for 6 days before this assignment. Floor plans, security camera grids, perimeter specs, staff rosters. I knew the compound's dimensions better than I knew my own apartment. What I hadn't prepared for was the way it actually looked in person. Imposing in the specific way that only very expensive things built by very private people tend to be. The kind of imposing that isn't trying to intimidate you. It simply doesn't consider whether you exist. My new employer. I exhaled slowly, watching the dock approach. The briefing had come through Harrow Security Group's internal channel on a Tuesday, flagged Priority Tier 1, which in my 9 years with the firm had happened exactly twice before. Both times involved heads of state. The subject line read, Sterling Vane / personal detail / San Juan compound / immediate placement. They'd given me a file, a real file, printed, not digital, which was unusual enough to make me sit up straighter. Siddhartha Sterling Vane, 29 years old, only child of Ellison Sterling Vane, chairman of the Sterling Vane Group, a conglomerate whose holdings spanned pharmaceutical distribution, satellite infrastructure, and private financial architecture across 6 continents. Current net worth of the family trust, estimated at $42 billion. Sid, that's what the file called her, and I'd had to adjust to thinking of the name that way, stripped of all its grandeur, was being positioned to assume operational control of the group's Asia-Pacific division ahead of a major corporate merger that would finalize within 90 days. The merger. That was the real weight of the assignment, the thing the briefing danced around without quite naming. A deal of this scale attracted attention, the file explained carefully. There had been 2 credible threat assessments in the past month. A minor incident at the Seattle office. An intercepted communication, origin unclear. Nothing definitive. Nothing that would alarm the average person. But in the world where I work, nothing definitive is exactly when you pay the most attention. My mandate? Full personal security detail. 24-hour protocol. Minimum 6-week placement, with extension likely through the merger's signing. The compound already had perimeter security, a contracted team that managed external threat assessment. My job was different, closer. I would be assigned to Siddhartha Sterling Vane herself. Not the building. She has requested a female officer, the file noted, in neutral language that I'd learned to read past. Requested was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I accepted the assignment without hesitation. I told myself it was because the terms were exceptional. I told myself it was because my caseload had gone quiet and I needed the work. Both things were true, and neither of them was the whole story. But I've always been better at doing things than at explaining why I do them. Miriam Cho met me at the dock. She was the compound's head of perimeter operations, mid-40s, compact and efficient in the way of someone who'd spent decades making efficiency a personality. And she walked me up the bluff path with the brisk energy of someone who had approximately 3 minutes to spare. "The family arrives this afternoon," she said without preamble. "Ms. Sterling Vane travels ahead. She's been in residence since yesterday. Just her? Her and a personal assistant, Dax Llewellyn. He's been vetted. You'll have his file waiting. The elder Mr. Sterling Vane is in London through the end of the week and won't be joining until the merger team does. I noted it, the way she said the elder Mr. Sterling Vane, distinguishing him without warmth. A way of speaking that suggested complexity without offering any of its details. Ms. Sterling Vane's daily schedule, I said. How fixed is it? Miriam gave me a sideways look that might have been appreciative. You'll negotiate that with her directly. She prefers to manage her own time. But she requested a personal detail. Her father requested a personal detail. A pause. She agreed to it. There was a world of information in the distance between those two sentences. I stored it carefully. The compound's interior was exactly what the schematics had promised, and somehow still more austere in person. The ground floor was given over to workspace, conference rooms, a monitoring center, a server room with its own cooling system that hummed faintly beneath everything like a second heartbeat. The residential floors were above. Clean lines, minimal art, the kind of spare luxury that announces itself through what it refuses to include. I noticed a single exception. On the landing between the first and second floors, someone had placed a small ceramic bowl painted in deep indigo and rust, clearly handmade, clearly old. It sat alone on a white shelf like a quiet argument. I stopped briefly in front of it. Miriam had kept walking. Your quarters are on the second floor, adjacent to Mizzy Sterling Vane's suite. You'll have direct interior access via the connecting hallway. The door from your side requires a code. Her side requires both code and biometric. So she can get to me, but I can't get to her. You'll be given her override key. Standard protocol is that you don't use it unless there's an active threat, or she requests it. Another pause. Miriam seemed to assemble her words with care. She values her privacy, particularly here. Understood. I was shown my room, which was spare and functional and had a wide window facing east over the water. I set down my bag. Then I went to work learning the space I'd be living inside. 3 hours, that's how long it took before I met her. I had spent those hours in methodical survey, walking each floor, cataloging every exit and entrance, testing the camera feeds in the monitoring center, reviewing the day staff rotation with the 2 guards who handled interior shifts. I was thorough. I am always thorough. It's not discipline exactly. It's more like the only thing standing between me and the particular anxiety of not knowing where the edges are. Some people ground themselves with routines of comfort, a familiar meal, a known voice on the phone, a specific chair. I ground myself by learning the shape of the space I'm responsible for until it becomes as readable as a face. The compound rewarded that kind of attention. It was complex in the way that very well-designed things are complex. Seamlessly, invisibly, in ways you only understood by walking slowly and asking the right questions. I'd found a service entrance on the lower level that wasn't on the schematics. Recent addition, still waiting for its camera mount. I'd found that the northeast stairwell had a dead zone in radio frequency, which the perimeter team had apparently flagged and not yet solved. Small things. The kind of small things that, assembled, tell you everything about how a place actually functions versus how it's supposed to function. I had filled half a page of notes before I looked up and realized the light through the monitoring room's high windows had shifted. Afternoon now. I rolled my shoulders, looked back at the screen, and heard footsteps on the stone floor behind me. Unhurried, precise. The kind of footsteps that move through space as if they expect it to accommodate them. You've been cataloging the blind spots. I turned. Siddhartha Sterling Vane was taller than her file photograph suggested. Or perhaps it was simply that photographs struggled to convey the particular quality of her stillness. She stood in the doorway of the monitoring room in dark trousers and a collarless gray top. Her black hair pulled back with such severity that it seemed less like a style choice and more like a decision about who she was willing to be. She was holding a mug of something steaming. Her eyes, darker than the bowl on the landing, dark and watchful, were already on me. No greeting, just the observation about the blind spots, offered with the calm certainty of someone who had simply noticed and chosen to say so. "You have 3, I said. "The eastern service corridor, the northwest quadrant of the garden between the hedgerow and the wall, and a 40-second window during camera cycling on the lower level's exterior north face. I've already flagged them with Miriam." Something shifted in her expression, not quite surprise, more like the quiet recalibration of someone adjusting an initial estimate. "You've been here 3 hours?" she said. 2 hours and 51 minutes. Another pause. She stepped fully into the room, which somehow made it smaller. Not because of her physical presence, though she had that too, but because of the attention she carried. "Most people spend the first day getting oriented. I did get oriented. This is what it looks like." For a moment, I thought I might have misjudged the tone, that the directness would land wrong. Then, very briefly, one corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the idea of a smile, glimpsed and then withdrawn before it could be confirmed. "Kestrel Nightjar," she said, reading it from the air between us like she'd memorized it and was choosing now to deploy it. "What does kestrel mean?" "It's a bird. Small falcon." "I know what it is." She was watching me with that unsettling, careful attention. "Why the name?" "Family tradition. My grandmother's side. Everyone gets a bird." She considered that. I couldn't tell what she was making of it. "With most people, you can read the surface. Even when the surface is guarded, there are tells." With Siddhartha Sterling Vane, I had the unsettling sense that what I was seeing was the surface, and that what lay beneath it was operating at a register I wasn't yet calibrated to read. "You can call me Kez," I said, though I hadn't planned to offer it. Professional protocol doesn't require it. Something in the conversation had pulled it out of me before I'd decided to give it. "I know," she said. "I read your file, too." She left the monitoring room as quietly as she'd entered. I stood for a moment looking at the doorway she'd passed through, then turned back to the camera feeds and made myself focus. Dinner in the compound that first evening was a solitary affair. For Sid, at least. Her assistant Dax, a wiry young man with quick eyes and the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to be useful without being noticed, confirmed that she almost always ate alone when in residence, preferring to work through the evening meal rather than treat it as an occasion. I ate in the staff kitchen with the 2 interior guards. Petra and Callum, both solid professionals who had been on compound detail for 8 months, and tried to absorb what they offered without seeming to extract it. Professionals notice when they're being assessed. The good ones, anyway. "She's not difficult," Petra offered, unprompted, over a bowl of pasta that was considerably better than I'd expected for a staff kitchen. "People assume she will be. She's not. She's just precise." "Precise," I repeated. "Like, if she says something, she means exactly that thing. No more, no less. Once you calibrate to it, it's actually easier than people who say one thing and mean something else." Petra shrugged. "Took me about 2 weeks." Callum, who was quieter, added, "She works late, always. You'll hear movement from her suite past midnight most nights. She's not restless. It's deliberate. She just doesn't sleep like a normal person. I filed all of it away. That night, I lay in the dark of my assigned room and listened to the compound settle around me. The cooling system, the distant sound of the water. And yes, at 11:47, the soft and deliberate sounds of movement from the suite next door. Not pacing, not insomnia, but the particular quality of someone who is working. Focused, present. I did not sleep well, which is normal for my first night in a new assignment. Instead, I thought about blind spots and camera cycling windows and a small ceramic bowl painted in indigo and rust. And I asked myself the professional question I always ask at the outset. What am I actually here to protect? The answer, I knew, was Siddhartha Sterling Vane. But I was beginning to sense that knowing her name and knowing who she was were two entirely different projects. The rhythm of the compound revealed itself over the following days, like a language I was learning in real time. Sid rose early, always before 6, and spent the first 2 hours of every morning in a ritual that, once I understood it, I found quietly striking. She swam, when the weather permitted, in the outdoor pool on the compound's south face. Not for exercise, or not only for that. The way she moved through the water had a deliberateness to it that spoke of something more internal. Then she went to a small room on the second floor that had been designated as a private study. No cameras, her explicit condition, one I'd been informed of before I arrived, and remained there for 90 minutes before her working day began. What she did in that room, I didn't know. My protocol forbade electronic surveillance of that space. My own instinct forbade speculation. Her days were structured around the merger's demands, calls with the legal team, reviews with financial analysts who joined remotely from Singapore and London and New York, strategy sessions that sometimes lasted until early evening. She moved through all of it with a composure that was almost architectural. No visible frustration. No exasperation. Just the careful, relentless application of intelligence to problem. I watched this from the permitted distances, and I did my job, and I tried to maintain the specific kind of professional detachment that is both required and, in my experience, not actually all that difficult to sustain. The difficulty, when it arrived, came from an unexpected direction. It was the 4th day. A Friday, though days of the week lose their particular texture when you're living inside a compound where the schedule is governed by time zones in Singapore and London rather than any local rhythm. The afternoon legal call had ended earlier than expected, and I was doing a perimeter walk on the east side of the compound when I nearly collided with Sid in the narrow corridor that connected the conference suite to the main hallway. She was moving fast, head down, and I stepped aside at the last second. We both stopped. She had a notebook in her hand, actual paper, which I'd noticed she favored for anything she didn't want digitized. And she was holding it slightly awkwardly, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of something. Her composure recovered instantly, the way a surface closes over something dropped into water. But there was a fraction of a second before the recovery, and in that fraction, I registered something I hadn't expected. She looked tired. Not the functional tiredness of overwork, but something older and more settled, the kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. The call ended early, I said. The Singapore team's approach to the licensing clause is untenable. We'll resume Monday. She said it flatly, like a weather report. Then, in a different register, "You don't have to explain my schedule back to me." I wasn't. I was explaining why I wasn't where you'd expect me to be at this time of day. Another one of those fractional recalibrations. Where would I expect you to be? Based on the pattern I've established, eastern perimeter between 3 and 4. You've noticed. She looked at me for a moment with those watchful, calibrated eyes. Yes, I have. A pause. You're systematic. Predictability is a liability in my work. I vary the patterns, but only in ways that maintain coverage. It's not the same as being random. No, she agreed slowly, as if she were actually thinking about it rather than filling silence. It's not. We stood in the corridor, and the moment stretched in a way that felt neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, exactly. More like a space that hadn't decided yet what it was. Where are you going? I asked, because it was relevant to my job, and because asking it was easier than the alternative, which was continuing to stand there saying nothing. She glanced at the notebook. The North Garden. I prefer to be outside when I can. I'll walk the perimeter from the north while you're out there. Something crossed her face. I still couldn't name what, with her. You don't need to be visible. I know. And I wasn't, or not obtrusively. I kept to the outer path that ran along the hedgerow while she sat on the low stone bench near the garden's center, notebook open in her lap. From my position, I had clear sight lines to the perimeter and to her, and I told myself that was the only reason I noticed what she was doing. She wasn't reviewing documents. She wasn't on her phone. She was writing, not the quick, executive notation of someone capturing meeting notes. This was different, slower, more deliberate, with the kind of attention that belongs to something private. She'd write a line, stop, look at the water visible over the bluff's edge, write again. Sometimes she crossed out what she'd written. Sometimes she stared at the page for a full minute without moving. I've done a lot of surveillance. I know how to observe without engaging, how to file what you see without letting it mean anything beyond what's operationally relevant. I've watched politicians and executives and heirs of every description go about the private business of their lives. And I've maintained the professional boundary that turns observation into security work rather than intrusion. What Siddhartha Sterling Vane was doing in that garden looked nothing like what I'd been told to expect from her. It looked quiet and private and a little bit raw. It looked like the part of a person they don't put in files. I looked away. I focused on the perimeter. I did my job, but I remembered what I'd seen. That was the problem. I remembered it with a specificity I didn't choose. The weekend arrived, which in the compound meant a slower frequency of calls, but no real cessation of work. Sid moved through Saturday with the same focused quiet, though I noticed she permitted herself one exception. In the late afternoon, she swam again, and afterward, instead of returning immediately to work, she sat at the edge of the pool for a long time, just sitting, looking at nothing I could identify. I was stationed near the south entrance, far enough to be unobtrusive, close enough to matter. Dax appeared at my elbow at some point, which was impressive because Dax moved through the compound with such practiced unobtrusiveness that you sometimes forgot he was there until he was directly beside you. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he offered me one with a smile that was pleasant and entirely without agenda. She does this sometimes, he said, looking in Sid's direction. Not explaining it, not editorializing, just acknowledging. Does what? Go still? She calls it thinking, but it's more like... He paused, selecting the word. Resetting. She carries a lot. I accepted the coffee because it would have been strange to refuse it. How long have you worked for her? 4 years, since her last year at Cambridge. He looked at the pool. She's extraordinary at what she does. That's real. But people see the capability, and they write the rest of themselves onto her. Assume she must want what they'd want in her position. I looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He smiled again, a small, slightly tired smile. Because you're going to be living 6 feet from her for the next 2 months, and you seem like someone who pays attention to the right things. A pause. Most people don't. He drifted away with the quiet efficiency that was his signature. And I stood with my coffee and considered whether I'd just been given information or a warning, and whether there was actually a difference. 4 years, he'd said. Long enough to know someone's textures, not just their surface. Long enough to understand the gap between what someone projects and what they're actually carrying. I looked at Sid by the pool, still motionless, still somewhere else behind those eyes. At the pool, Sid hadn't moved. The late afternoon light was doing something specific to the water and to her face. One of those unrepeatable arrangements of late light that exists for 30 seconds and then never again. She looked, in that light, less like an heiress and less like a strategic asset and less like an assignment and more like a person who was very far from wherever she actually wanted to be. I drank my coffee and made myself look at the perimeter. The first real breach of my professional composure, if you could call it that, if you could call such a small thing a breach, happened on Sunday evening. I had been reviewing the compound's access logs in the monitoring room, cross-referencing them against the staff schedule, a routine I performed at the end of each day. The compound was quiet. The day staff had finished their shift. Dax was in his quarters, and Sid had retreated to her suite 2 hours earlier. At 10:43, I heard the door to the stairwell open and close. Footsteps on the stone. They stopped outside the monitoring room's door. A knock. 2, precise and brief. "Come in," I said, though I already knew. She was wearing something softer than her daytime clothes. Dark trousers again, but the shirt was linen, slightly rumpled, sleeves pushed to the elbow. She was barefoot. I'd never seen Siddhartha Sterling Vane barefoot before, and there was something about it that landed differently than I expected. Not disorienting. More like a shift in resolution. The same image, but suddenly sharper. She was holding a book, with one finger marking a page. "The monitoring room light is the only one on in this wing," she said. "I thought someone had left it on by mistake. I work late." "Apparently." She looked at the screens, the camera feeds, the access logs open on the secondary monitor. "You're still going through the access history." "Daily habit." "For how many days?" "Until I know it by reflex." I looked at her. "Was there something you needed?" She glanced at the book in her hand as if she'd briefly forgotten she was holding it. "No, I was looking for the kitchen." "Different route than I normally take." The kitchen was on the opposite side of the building. The monitoring room was not, by any reasonable interpretation of the compound's layout, on the way to the kitchen from her suite. I didn't say that. "There's a kettle in the staff kitchen as well," I offered instead. "Second left after the utility corridor." She nodded. A pause that had no clear purpose, and yet didn't feel purposeless. That was the thing about her silences. They weren't the uncomfortable silences of someone with nothing to say. They were more like considered spaces, chosen rather than defaulted into. Then, with the same straightforward delivery, she applied to everything. "Do you actually enjoy this work?" I thought about deflecting. The professional response assembled itself in my mind. Service, responsibility, skill application. And I let it go. "Yes," I said instead. "I do." "Why?" The question was simple and direct, and she asked it the way she asked everything, which was as though she actually wanted the answer and had already ruled out the polite version. Something in the hour or the quiet of the compound around us, or some quality of the light in that room made the space feel honest in a way that most spaces don't. Because the work is honest, I said. There's no ambiguity in what's required. Either someone is safe or they aren't. Either the threat is real or it isn't. Everything I do maps directly onto a clear outcome. I find that, I searched for the right word, grounding. She was looking at me with an expression I'd started to recognize without being able to name. Attentive and somewhat removed. As if she were processing not just the content of what I said, but the fact that I'd said it, and something else. Something that moved beneath the surface of that careful attention, like a current under ice. I didn't try to name it. You mean the opposite of everything else? She said. I met her eyes. Yes, pretty much. Another pause. Something passed between us in it. Nothing I could have articulated, nothing I would have wanted to, just a frequency of recognition that registered and then was gone. Like that bowl on the landing, something deliberately placed in a space that was otherwise very careful about what it allowed. Good night, Kez, she said. Good night, Miss Sterling Vane. She left. I listened to her barefoot footsteps recede down the hallway and then disappear into the stairwell. And then I sat for a moment in the light of the monitors, not reviewing anything, just sitting. I thought, she wasn't looking for the kitchen. Then I went back to the access logs and made myself be useful. Monday brought the Singapore team back, and with them, the grinding legal machinery of the merger, which operated at a volume and intensity that transformed the compound into something closer to a command center. I counted 7 additional staff arrivals via the morning ferry. Analysts, a pair of lawyers from the firm handling the Pacific filing, a liaison from the merger's counterpart company whose name I didn't catch and filed under low threat, standard protocol. Sid moved through the day's sessions with the focused precision I'd come to expect. But I noticed, and I was always noticing, it was the baseline condition of my work, that the nature of her composure was different in these meetings than it was in the garden or the corridor or the quiet space of a late-night hallway. In the meetings, it was more like armor, functional, well-fitted, covering everything that mattered. Not false. That was important. Whatever Sid wore in those rooms was genuinely her. But it was only a part of her, and watching it operate at full deployment, I found myself thinking about the notebook in the garden and the barefoot walk to the monitoring room and the exhaustion I'd seen in that fraction of a second in the corridor. And I thought, which of these is the real one? And then I stopped thinking it, because it was the kind of thought I couldn't afford. The day ended late. The Singapore team remained past 9, which compressed the dinner hour and meant Sid ate nothing but a plate of something Dax had assembled and left on her conference room desk. I was doing a pass through the residential corridor when I saw the untouched plate through the glass. She hadn't stopped, hadn't paused, hadn't looked up from the documents in front of her. I kept walking. But later, much later, after the day's staff had gone and the compound had settled into its nighttime frequency, I brought a pot of tea to the monitoring room and left 1 cup outside her suite's door. I didn't knock. I left it there, on the floor outside the door, and went back to my room. I told myself it was a human gesture, not a personal one, that there's a category of basic care that exists inside professionalism and doesn't threaten it. I'd brought coffee to Petra and Callum. I'd made tea for myself. This was adjacent. In the morning, the cup was gone, rinsed and placed on the hallway windowsill with a small square of paper folded next to it. I unfolded it. Thank you, S. 2 words and an initial. I folded the paper again and put it in my pocket, which was not a thing I normally did with correspondence related to my assignments, and which I chose not to examine too closely. I thought about it later. That small square of paper. The deliberateness of rinsing the cup before returning it. The way she'd placed it on the windowsill rather than outside my door or in my hand. Sid was precise about everything, even this. The paper was not a casual act. It was a chosen one, a response calibrated in the way all her responses were calibrated, which was to say it contained exactly what she meant to put into it and nothing accidental. What she meant? I wasn't certain. That was the part I was trying not to spend too much time with. I ran a full perimeter check in the early morning and noted that the eastern camera lag had increased to nearly 4 seconds overnight, which meant the system needed servicing sooner rather than later. I submitted the maintenance request and wrote it in my log and thought briefly and precisely about nothing else. 9 days in. That was when everything I'd been carefully maintaining tilted just slightly, just enough to matter. A storm had come in overnight. Nothing dangerous, a March system that brought rain and low cloud and the specific kind of coastal gray that makes the world feel smaller. The morning swim didn't happen. The garden was out. The compound folded in on itself in the way enclosed spaces do when the weather removes the outside as an option. I was in the hallway outside the private study. Sid had been inside for her usual 90 minutes, and I was doing a standing watch that was technically unnecessary but felt right. When the door opened. She didn't come out. She stood in the doorway. I looked at her, because looking at her was my job, and because I was beginning to understand that it was becoming something else as well, and that pretending otherwise was taking more energy than the alternative. "What do you do?" she said, without any preliminary, "when you're assigned somewhere for a long time and you start to go a little crazy from the repetition?" "I find new things to notice," I said. She looked at me. "New things. There are always details you missed in the first pass. The work is in the layers." She considered this in the particular way she considered things, whole and complete attention, nothing withheld. "And do you? Find new things?" "Yes." A pause. She stepped back from the doorway, not retreating, more like making room. "Come in," she said. The private study was small and south-facing, and despite the gray of the day, it had a gathered quality of light that the rest of the compound lacked. A desk, a chair, stacks of books that were not arranged, but clearly not random. The particular organization of someone who knows where everything is through intimacy, not system. On the desk, the notebook I'd seen in the garden, open. I stood inside the door, not advancing. "You've never invited staff into this room." "I've never had staff who were interesting enough to." She sat in the chair, pulled her knees up, which was the most informal I'd seen her. "Sit down, Kez. I'm not going to make you stand at attention." I sat in the room's other chair, which was angled toward the window. The rain was moving in sheets across the glass. "What do you read?" she asked. "History, mostly. Military history. Some philosophy." I paused. "Poetry, occasionally." Something shifted in her face. The same fractional recalibration I'd seen before, but warmer this time and less controlled. "Poetry. My mother. She read it aloud when I was young. I never fully left it." Sid looked at the notebook on her desk. A long look. Then, "I write it." The space between us held that for a moment. "I suspected," I said carefully. "How?" "The garden. The way you write is different from how you take meeting notes. The rhythm of it is different." She looked at me with something I hadn't seen before. Not the composure, not the armor, Not even the careful attentiveness she deployed in our earlier conversations. Something more exposed and less defended. "No one has ever said that to me," she said. Not in those specific terms. "I'm observant," I said. "It's my job." "It might be your job," she said quietly. "But what you just described isn't surveillance. That's attention." A pause. Those aren't the same thing. The rain intensified briefly, drumming on the glass, and then eased. I sat in Siddhartha Sterling Vane's private study on a gray Tuesday morning and thought about the difference between surveillance and attention. And I understood, with the particular clarity that comes when you've been suppressing a recognition long enough that it stops being possible, that I was in significant trouble, not immediately, not visibly, but the way a structure is compromised before the crack becomes visible, already, and probably for longer than I'd admitted to myself. I stood up. I should get back to the perimeter. She didn't argue, didn't ask me to stay, just watched me with those deep, careful eyes and said, "The Eastern Corridor's camera has a 2-second lag. You flagged it day 1, but Miriam hasn't had it serviced yet." "I know," I said. "I work around it." "I know you do," she said. "I noticed." I left the study and closed the door behind me, and I walked the Eastern Corridor. And I made myself focus on the 2-second camera lag and the technical problem it represented, and I did not think about poetry or the way she'd looked when she said attention like it was something rare and worth naming. I almost managed it.